The city hummed with its usual rhythm, a patchwork of hurried footsteps, honking cars, and conversations that faded into the background. Among this chaos, Emily Sullivan wheeled herself down the sidewalk, her gaze fixed forward. She had grown used to the weight of being unnoticed, to the polite avoidance of strangers who looked away when their eyes grazed her wheelchair. But today was different. A faint spark of courage had driven her to step outside her comfort zone, to break free from the small, safe world she had confined herself to since her accident. Her destination wasn't far, just a few blocks to the neighborhood bookstore where she often escaped into the lives of fictional characters. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves, and Emily allowed herself a fleeting smile. It was the first time in weeks that simply existing didn't feel overwhelming. Then it happened. A slight miscalculation, a crack in the pavement she hadn't seen, jerked the wheels of her chair, sending her careening toward the curb. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping metal jolted her senses. Her heart plummeted as she realized her wheelchair had left a long, jagged mark on the sleek, black paint of a parked luxury car. Panic set in before the full weight of what happened could register. Her hands gripped the cold steel rims of her chair as her mind raced. She tried to reverse and undo the damage somehow, but the deep scratch glared under the sunlight. Emily's throat tightened as the car door opened with deliberate slowness, and out stepped a man she would never have expected, a man whose presence alone could change her life forever. The man who emerged from the car was Ryan Caldwell, a figure whose name carried weight in the upper echelons of the city's elite. Tall and composed, he radiated the confidence that came with years of success and privilege. His tailored suit barely wrinkled as he closed the door with an elegance that made the moment feel almost cinematic. Emily froze. She had no idea who he was, but his commanding presence was impossible to ignore. Her heart thudded in her chest as he turned to inspect the damage. His expression remained unreadable, his sharp, green eyes flicking between the scratch and Emily. I'm so sorry, she stammered, trembling. It was an accident. I didn't see. Ryan raised a hand, silencing her apology. The gesture wasn't rude but firm, as if he needed a moment to assess the situation before addressing her. Emily braced herself for the scolding she was sure was coming. A sharp rebuke, a demand for compensation she couldn't afford. After all, that car was worth more than she made in a year. But when Ryan finally spoke, his voice carried an unexpected calm. Are you all right? Emily blinked, stunned. What? I asked if you're okay, he repeated, stepping closer. His tone was steady, almost gentle, catching her off guard. The way your chair hit the curb. It looked like you might have hurt yourself. The words were so unexpected, so contrary to the narrative she had built in her mind, that Emily found herself momentarily speechless. People didn't usually ask how she was. Most saw her wheelchair first and her humanity second, if at all. And yet here he was, focusing on her, not the scratch on his expensive car. I'm fine, she managed to say, though her hands were still trembling slightly. I'm fine. It's your car I'm worried about. Ryan glanced back at the scratch, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of irritation cross his face, but it was gone just as quickly. When he turned back to her, something else was in his expression, perhaps curiosity or recognition of a kindred spirit. Cars can be fixed, he said, brushing the matter aside with an ease that left Emily dumbfounded. You, conversely, seem like you could use a coffee. How about we fix that instead? Emily stared at him, unsure if she had misheard. Excuse me? Ryan's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but was warm nonetheless. I know a place just around the corner. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit here and keep apologizing for something that's already done. The offer hung in the air between them, strange and disarming. Emily hesitated. Her instinct was to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her usual routines. But something about Ryan's presence, his unexpected kindness, his refusal to treat her with pity, made her pause. Against every instinct telling her to say no, she nodded. Okay. As Ryan gestured for her to follow, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than an accident. It was the start of something she couldn't yet define. A collision of two lives that would alter both in ways neither could predict. The coffee shop was warm. Its scent of roasted beans mingled with the quiet conversation hum. Ryan chose a table by the window, and Emily wheeled beside him, unsure why she had agreed to this strange encounter. She felt exposed in the bustling cafe, her wheelchair a glaring symbol of what she had lost since the accident. As Ryan ordered for them, a cappuccino for himself and a chamomile tea for her after asking if she had a preference, Emily studied him from across the table. His movements were deliberate and his posture relaxed. Everything about him screamed confidence, yet his demeanor carried a softness that surprised her. "So," Ryan began, his gaze meeting hers as the drinks arrived, "what brings you here today? You don't strike me as someone who spends her afternoons scratching up luxury cars." Emily hesitated, her fingers curling around the warm mug before her. "Honestly, I don't leave the house much," she admitted, her voice quieter than intended. "Today was an attempt to feel normal, I guess." Ryan tilted his head, his expression thoughtful but not pitying. "And how's that going for you?" She huffed a dry laugh, the sound almost bitter. "Well, considering I just damaged someone's car, I'd say not great." Ryan chuckled softly, and the sound eased some of the tension in her chest. "Normal isn't all it's cracked up to be. Trust me. Sometimes, the unexpected detours end up being the most meaningful." Emily couldn't tell if he was just being polite or if there was a more profound truth behind his words, but she found herself wanting to believe him. She hadn't had a meaningful conversation with someone outside her small circle in months. Her days had become a monotonous loop of silence and writing, her only escape from the confines of her life. "Do you always talk like that?" she asked, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Like you're trying to impart some kind of life lesson?" Ryan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Occupational hazard. I spend a lot of time around people who think money solves everything. Sometimes, you have to remind them that it doesn't." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And does it solve everything?" His smile faltered slightly, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of something more complex in his expression. "Not the things that matter," he said simply, his voice quieter now. "Not really." The honesty in his answer caught Emily off guard, and for a moment, the distance she had felt between them seemed to shrink. But as much as she wanted to ask what he meant, the words stayed locked in her throat. She wasn't ready to delve into her pain, let alone someone else's. Instead, she deflected. "I write," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "That's what I do most days. It's the one thing that still feels like mine." Ryan's expression softened. "What do you write?" "Stories," Emily said, her gaze dropping to the table. "Mostly for kids. About adventures and magic. Things I don't think I'll ever experience again." Ryan was quiet momentarily, and Emily braced herself for the inevitable platitudes about how she could still do anything she put her mind to. "But instead," he said, "sounds like you're giving other people what you need most." Emily looked up, startled by the simplicity of his statement. It wasn't pity. It wasn't condescension. It was understanding. And for the first time, she felt like someone indeed saw her. That evening, back in the quiet of her small apartment, Emily opened her laptop. The blank page stared back at her, as daunting as ever. But her conversation with Ryan lingered in her mind. His words had stirred something, an ache she had tried to bury since the accident. She began typing, her fingers moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. The story unfolded slowly at first. A tale of a girl who, like Emily, had lost something precious but found herself in a world of magic where her unique abilities made her a hero. The character wasn't whole. She was scarred and unsure of her place in the world. But she was brave, even when she didn't feel it. The hours slipped by unnoticed. When Emily finally looked up, the clock read past midnight. She rubbed her tired eyes, but the exhaustion felt different, earned rather than the weight of endless days spent doing nothing. She felt a flicker of purpose for the first time in a long while. Over the next few weeks, writing became her lifeline. It wasn't just an escape anymore, but a way to reclaim herself. Her stories took on a life of their own, reflecting her inner struggles and triumphs. She posted them online under a pseudonym, never expecting anyone to notice. But the feedback came quickly, comments from readers who said her stories resonated with them, who thanked her for giving them hope. Still, the world outside her window remained distant. Emily wasn't ready to face it thoroughly, and the loneliness of her reality pressed in on her during quiet moments. Her mother called often, trying to coax her into therapy or social outings, but Emily always found excuses to avoid them. Their conversations, though well-meaning, usually ended in frustration. Her mother wanted her to move forward, but Emily couldn't see how. Then, one day, an email arrived that would change everything. "Dear Miss Sullivan, we found your work and would love to discuss a potential collaboration. We believe your voice would be a perfect fit for our team of writers." Emily reread the words, her hands trembling. Someone had found her stories, her small, personal creations, and thought they were worth something. It felt unreal, like a dream she wasn't ready to trust. But as the reality of the offer sank in, so did the fear. Could she do this? Could she handle the pressure of deadlines and an audience, of putting herself out there in a way she hadn't since the accident? Her phone buzzed, and Ryan's name flashed on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "What's up?" Emily swallowed hard, her nerves bubbling to the surface. "I got an offer," she blurted out, "to write for a magazine. A real one." There was a pause, and then Ryan's laugh, full of joy and pride, rang through the line. "Emily, that's incredible. I told you your stories were special." Her chest tightened, the fear and excitement tangling together. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Ryan said firmly. "You've already proven that. This is just the next chapter." His confidence steadied her, and as they talked, Emily felt the fear begin to loosen its grip. By the time she hung up, she had made her decision. She would say yes, not just to the offer, but to the chance to step into something bigger than herself. As she pressed send on her acceptance email that night, she couldn't help but feel that her story, the one she had thought was over, was only beginning. Emily didn't realize how profoundly the writing offer would affect her until a week later. The tiny, hesitant spark of hope it ignited began to grow. Yet, with every step forward, there was a lingering sense of hesitation, of whether she deserved the opportunities coming her way. As if sensing her internal struggle, Ryan called her often, his voice steady and warm on the other end of the line. But one crisp autumn afternoon, Ryan showed up at her door unannounced. Emily's heart skipped as she opened the door to find him standing there, a paper bag in one hand and an easy grin on his face. He looked as though he belonged anywhere but in the quiet hallway of her small apartment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice betraying surprise and self-consciousness. "Thought you might need a break," Ryan said, holding the bag. "I brought sandwiches and coffee. And before you say no, I'm not leaving until you join me." Emily hesitated, but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Fine," she said, returning to let him in. "But only because I'm hungry." They sat at the small kitchen table, the city's sound faint through the window. Ryan spread out their meal with the precision of someone who understood the value of small comforts. As they ate, the conversation turned naturally to her writing. "So," Ryan began, "have you started working on your first story for the magazine?" Emily looked down at her sandwich, unsure how to answer. "I've started thinking about it," she admitted. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Thinking?" She sighed. "It's harder than I thought it would be. When I wrote before, it was just for me. Now, knowing people are expecting something, it's intimidating." Ryan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You know why they picked you, right?" Emily frowned slightly. "Because they needed a writer?" "No," Ryan said, his voice firm but kind. "Because your stories have something real in them. They wouldn't have reached out if they didn't see that. Trust yourself." His words landed heavier than she expected. Emily nodded slowly, feeling the knot of self-doubt in her chest loosen. She had spent so much time thinking of herself as broken and no longer had anything valuable to offer. However, Ryan's belief in her was unwavering, and for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of believing in herself. Before he left, Ryan hesitated at the door, looking as though he wanted to say something. "You know," he began, "you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you need. An editor, a cheerleader, someone to share bad coffee with. I'm here." Emily's chest tightened at his sincerity, but she only nodded. "Thank you, Ryan. That means a lot." As the door closed behind him, Emily couldn't help but feel that his presence had shifted something fundamental within her. Ryan wasn't just a friend or a helpful voice on the other end of the phone. He was becoming part of her story in a way she hadn't anticipated. It started with a single visit to Ryan's home. The invitation had been casual, an offhand comment about how his daughter, Lila, loved hearing about dinosaurs, and that Emily's storytelling skills might make her an instant favorite. Despite her initial reluctance, Emily found herself accepting. Something about Ryan's gentle persistence made it hard to say no. When Emily arrived, the air was crisp, and the golden leaves scattered across Ryan's front yard glowed under the late afternoon sun. Lila greeted her at the door, her wide grin lighting up her face as she eagerly helped Emily navigate her wheelchair inside. "You're here," Lila exclaimed, her voice brimming with excitement. "Dad said you tell the best stories. Do you know about the Velociraptor? It's my favorite." Emily couldn't help but laugh, her earlier nervousness melting in the face of Lila's enthusiasm. "I know a thing or two," she said. "Maybe you can teach me something." Ryan appeared behind his daughter, a warm smile on his face as he watched the interaction. "I told you she'd like you," he said quietly. They spent the afternoon in the cozy chaos of Ryan's home. Lila chattered endlessly about dinosaurs, interrupting herself only to ask Emily questions about her wheelchair, her favorite books, and whether she knew how to make pancakes. Emily found herself laughing more than she had in months, her usual guardedness slipping away in the presence of Lila's genuine curiosity and Ryan's steady, reassuring presence. When Lila eventually dashed to the living room to fetch her dinosaur toys, Ryan turned to Emily. "She's taken to you," he said, his voice soft. "She's incredible," Emily replied, her tone genuine. "You've done an amazing job with her." Ryan shrugged modestly. "She makes it easy." The conversation hung between them for a moment, and Emily felt a pang of admiration for the life Ryan had built. Despite his struggles, he had created a home filled with warmth and laughter, something she had convinced herself she would never have again. Over the next few weeks, Emily became a regular presence at Ryan's house. She and Lila bonded over books and crafts, and Emily found herself telling stories aloud for the first time in years, her words filling the spaces where her silence had once lived. Ryan, meanwhile, was always there, cooking dinner, offering quiet encouragement, and slowly breaking through the walls Emily had built around herself. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table after Lila had gone to bed, Ryan looked at Emily with an expression that tightened her chest. "You know," he said, "I think you're braver than you realize." Emily frowned slightly. "Brave? I don't feel brave." "You are," Ryan insisted. "It takes courage to rebuild yourself after everything you've been through, to keep going, and to let people in." His words stayed with her long after she left that night. Ryan was right. She was letting people in again, but it terrified her. After years of feeling like a burden, she struggled to believe she could be part of something good without ruining it. But Ryan and Lila made her feel like she could belong to something again, even if she wasn't sure she deserved it. As Emily sat at her desk that night, staring at her half-finished story, she felt a flicker of something new, hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a life she thought she had lost forever. In the weeks that followed, Emily poured herself into her work. The first story she submitted to the children's magazine was met with an enthusiastic response from the editor. They loved her voice, its warmth, honesty, and ability to spark wonder. Her stories had a unique way of weaving magic into everyday life, of making the ordinary extraordinary. As her writing career blossomed, Emily began receiving letters from readers. At first, they trickled in slowly, just a few notes from parents and teachers who expressed how much her stories meant to their children. But as more of her work was published, the feedback grew. One day, Emily received a letter from a young girl named Sophie. "Dear Emily, I read your story about the girl who found magic in her backyard. I think that girl is just like me. I can't run or jump like my friends, but your story made me feel like I can still do something extraordinary. Thank you for helping me believe that. Love, Sophie. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears as she read and reread the letter. Sophie's words struck a chord deep within her. It was the first time she truly understood the impact of her work. Her stories weren't just words on a page. They were connections, lifelines for children who needed to see themselves as capable and extraordinary, no matter their circumstances. Bolstered by this realization, Emily began to explore new themes in her writing. She wrote about bravery that didn't always look like heroics, finding strength in vulnerability and the quiet power of perseverance. She wrote about things she had lived through, and in doing so, she began to heal parts of herself she hadn't even realized were still broken. Her newfound confidence wasn't limited to her career. She started accepting more event invitations and speaking to small groups about her writing journey. Public speaking was a challenge. Her anxiety often bubbled to the surface, but she found strength in the faces of the children and parents who came to hear her. Each appearance was a small step forward, proof that she was no longer confined by the limits she had once imposed on herself. Meanwhile, Emily's relationship with Ryan and Lila continued to grow. What had started as casual visits evolved into something more profound that felt dangerously close to the life Emily had long convinced herself she could never have. One chilly evening, Emily arrived at Ryan's house for dinner. Lila greeted her at the door with her usual enthusiasm, practically pulling her inside to show off her latest school project, a hand-drawn book about dinosaurs. Ryan smiled from the kitchen, where the scent of roasted chicken filled the air. "Your biggest fan is getting ambitious," he said as Emily wheeled herself to the table. "She's decided she's going to be a writer, just like you." Emily laughed, her chest warming at the thought. "She's already got the creativity for it," she said. "I'm just lucky to be her inspiration." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did. Ryan had a way of making Emily feel seen without ever making her feel small. He listened to her stories about the magazine, offered advice without overstepping, and encouraged her to celebrate her victories, no matter how small they seemed. But as Lila disappeared into the living room to play that night, Ryan lingered at the table. His gaze rested on Emily, and something in his expression, soft but serious, made her heart skip. "You know," he began, his voice quiet, "I don't think I've ever thanked you." "For what?" Emily asked, confused. "For being here," Ryan said simply. "For letting me and Lila be part of your life. You've brought something into our home I didn't even realize we were missing." Emily's breath caught. She looked at him, searching for the right words, but all she could manage was, "I think it's the other way around." Ryan's smile was small, almost shy, a rare look on him. "Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other," he said softly. The air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily felt her walls trembling, the ones she had built so carefully to keep people out. Ryan's presence had been chipping away at them for weeks, but now it felt like they might finally crumble. "I'm scared, Ryan," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this, to let someone in without falling apart." Ryan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, steady. "You don't have to do it all at once," he said. "And you don't have to do it alone. I'm not going anywhere, Emily." For the first time, Emily let herself believe him. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. Ryan and Lila weren't just her friends. They were becoming her family, piece by piece, in a way that felt quiet and natural but no less profound. As Emily left that night, the cold air biting at her cheeks, she felt a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Her career was taking off, her heart was beginning to open again, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope this could be the start of something beautiful. As Emily's life blossomed in ways she never expected, her relationship with her mother hovered in the background, unresolved and strained. The tension between them had always been a quiet undercurrent rooted in her mother's insistence on pushing Emily toward therapy and recovery, a battle Emily had resisted for years. But the changes in her life, the magazine, Ryan, and Lila, made her realize that the fracture in their bond was a weight she could no longer carry. One afternoon, her mother called. Emily hesitated before answering, but something in her mother's voice stopped her from brushing it off as she had so many times before. Emily, her mother began, her tone careful. I was thinking, maybe I could come by this weekend? I could bring some of your favorite cookies, the ones I used to make when you were a kid. Emily felt her chest tighten. It had been years since her mother's tone held anything other than urgency or worry. You don't have to do that, Mom, she said, though her voice softened. You don't have to bring anything. Her mother paused. I know. I'd like to see you. No pressure. Just us. For the first time, Emily didn't push back. Okay, she said, her voice quieter. This weekend, when her mother arrived, she came bearing cookies and a quiet determination to mend what had been broken. As they sat together in Emily's small living room, the air was heavy with unspoken words. They talked about simple things at first, childhood memories and shared moments from the past, but eventually, the conversation turned to the present. I'm proud of you, Emily, her mother said suddenly, breaking the silence. For the writing, for everything. I don't know if I've said that enough. Emily blinked, stunned. Her mother had always been supportive in her way, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like breaking through a barrier she hadn't realized existed. Thank you, Emily said softly. That means a lot. Her mother reached across the table, taking Emily's hand. I know I've pushed you too hard before. I didn't know how else to help. Seeing you now, though, you've come so far alone. I'm just glad you're letting me back in. Emily squeezed her mother's hand, her throat tight with emotion. You never left, Mom. I just wasn't ready to let you see me like this. They didn't resolve everything in that single conversation. Years of tension couldn't disappear overnight, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Emily felt they were standing on common ground, ready to rebuild. A few weeks later, Emily received an unexpected email. It was an invitation to her high school's alum event, a celebration honoring graduates who had achieved something significant. Her first instinct was to delete it. The idea of facing people from her past, people who knew her before the accident, was overwhelming. But the email lingered in her mind, tugging at her in ways she couldn't ignore. When she mentioned the invitation to Ryan, he didn't hesitate. You should go, he said simply. Emily shook her head. It's not that easy. What if they just see the wheelchair? What if all they remember is who I was before? Ryan leaned forward, his expression steady. And what if they see how far you've come? What if they hear your story and realize how strong you are? You've worked so hard to rebuild your life, Emily. Don't hide that. His words stayed with her, and after days of deliberation, she typed a simple response. I'll be there. Emily wheeled herself into the school auditorium the night of the event, her heart pounding. The space felt familiar and foreign, filled with faces she recognized but hadn't seen in years. She caught sight of Allison Turner, her former best friend, laughing with her husband near the refreshments table. Across the room, Brian Adams, once the star quarterback, was chatting with an old teacher. And then, near the back, she saw Ethan, her high school boyfriend, the boy who had been with her the day of the accident. His family surrounded him, his arm casually draped over his wife's shoulder. Emily's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep moving. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself. The principal took the stage, welcoming everyone and introducing the evening's honorees. When Emily's name was called, she felt every eye in the room turn toward her. For a moment, she froze, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair. But then she remembered Ryan's words, remembered the journey that had brought her here, and she forced herself to move. Warm and genuine applause filled the room as she walked onto the stage. The principal introduced her as a celebrated children's author who had used her challenges to inspire others. When it was her turn to speak, Emily took a deep breath and steadied herself. Hi, everyone, she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. I never imagined I'd be standing, or sitting, here today. I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me a few years ago that I'd be here, sharing my story. She paused, glancing out at the audience. Ethan was watching her, but so were countless others. Teachers, parents, students, each face a reminder of the life she had left behind and the one she had built. I've faced challenges I never thought I could overcome, she continued. But those challenges have shaped me in ways I couldn't have predicted. They've taught me that life doesn't end when everything changes, but becomes something new. And if there's one thing I've learned, we're all stronger than we think. The applause that followed was louder this time, and as Emily wheeled herself back to her seat, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced her past, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a part of her story, which she was proud to share. In the weeks following the Alum event, Emily felt renewed peace. Facing her past had been cathartic, but the people in her present, Ryan and Lila, gave her the strength to embrace the future. Their bond had grown deeper, quieter, and more natural, like the steady rhythm of a familiar song. One rainy evening, Emily returned to Ryan's house for dinner. Lila had insisted on making spaghetti, and the kitchen was filled with laughter as she and Ryan tried to navigate the mess they'd created. Emily sat at the table, watching them, her heart packed in a way she hadn't expected. "Do you think the dinosaurs ate spaghetti?" Lila asked, her face streaked with flour as she twirled noodles on a fork. Ryan chuckled. "I think they were more into meat, kiddo. Maybe the herbivores liked spaghetti," Emily added, playing along. "They could have used plants for the sauce." Lila's eyes lit up. "I'm going to write a story about that. A dinosaur spaghetti party." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "I'd love to read it." After dinner, as Lila ran off to draw pictures of her imagined dinosaur feast, Ryan and Emily stayed behind to clean up. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the kitchen felt warm, filled with the ease Emily hadn't experienced in years. "You know," Ryan said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about something." Emily looked up, her hands stilling on the dish she was drying. "What's that?" He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Us. I know we haven't defined anything, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. To both of us. You're not just a friend, Emily. You're family." The words hung in the air, and Emily felt her chest tighten. She had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it and longing for it in equal measure. "Ryan," she began, trembling, "I don't know if I can give you what you deserve. I'm still figuring so much out." Ryan stepped closer, his hand resting gently on hers. "We'll figure it out together. You don't have to have all the answers, Emily. You just have to let me be here for you." For a long moment, they stood there, the space between them filled with unspoken emotions. And then, for the first time, Emily allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could let this happen, that she could have a family again. Emily's writing career continued to grow, and each story she published reached more children and families than she had ever imagined. The letters poured in, messages of gratitude, shared experiences, and hope sparked by her words. But one letter, in particular, stood out. It came from a teacher named Mrs. Roberts, who worked at a school for children with disabilities. Her students, she wrote, had been captivated by Emily's stories, finding pieces of themselves in her characters. The teacher asked if Emily might visit the school and speak to the students to show them that their challenges didn't define them. The idea terrified Emily. Public speaking had never been her strength, and dressing in a room full of children felt overwhelming. But Ryan encouraged her, as always, reminding her of the impact her stories had already made. "You've been inspiring them from a distance," he said. "Imagine what you could do face to face." So, with his and Lila's support, Emily agreed. The day of the visit, she wheeled into the brightly lit classroom, her nerves threatening to consume her. But the moment she saw the students, eager, curious, and full of life, her fear melted away. She spoke to them about her journey, about how she had turned her pain into stories that gave her strength. She read one of her favorite pieces aloud, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder. When she finished, a young boy raised his hand. "Do you think I can be a writer, too?" he asked, his voice quiet but determined. Emily smiled, her heart swelling. "I don't think you can. I know you can." As she left the school that day, Emily felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was searching for. Her stories weren't just her own anymore. They belonged to the world, to the people who needed them as much as she once had. Months later, Emily's life looked entirely different. She had moved into a small house with Ryan and Lila, their days filled with laughter, shared meals, and the quiet moments that made life feel whole. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and light, a reflection of the family they had built together. One sunny afternoon, Emily sat in the backyard with Lila, helping her plant flowers in a small garden. Ryan watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand and a soft smile on his face. "You've turned her into quite the gardener," he said, his voice teasing. Emily laughed, brushing dirt from her hands. "She's the one teaching me. I just follow her lead." Later that evening, after Lila had gone to bed, Emily and Ryan sat together on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. The air was cool, but the warmth between them was undeniable. "You know," Ryan said, his voice soft, "I never thought I'd have this, a real family. After everything with Lila's mom, I didn't think it was possible." Emily reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I didn't either. But you and Lila, you've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again." He looked at her, his gaze steady and full of love. "We've given each other something worth holding on to." At that moment, Emily knew she was no longer defined by her past, by her accident, her pain, or the life she had lost. She had built something new, something beautiful, with the people who had come into her life when she needed them most. Her days were now filled with writing, with moments of joy and growth, and with the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Sitting there with Ryan under the vast, starlit sky, she felt a peace that she hadn't thought possible, a peace that came from knowing her story was far from over.